As you might have noticed by looking at my upload schedule this past week, it's been a little while since I've gotten a chance to sit down and record one of these little reviews. And I must say I somewhat missed the experience. A sense of consistency and normality is certainly more than welcome, given the bombardment of academic expectations I'm trying to overcome, not dissimilar to a fish swimming upstream in a heavy current. Now, shooter games, whether they be first person or third person, are notoriously difficult to get right. A lot of solo developers, small teams, and even AAA studios have tried their hand at it and failed. Contrary to popular belief, building a game where the gunplay really stands out as not only different to, but also better than its peers is a lot easier said than done. And when you have a shooter game that strips away a lot of that core, sophisticated Hollywood-style focus on narrative and world building in favor of just focusing on the bare mechanics, as is the case with your more arcadey, fast-paced run-and-gun style FPS game, you take a certain risk. The smaller the focus, the more important it is that you do your due diligence and get everything right. I don't really have a preference either way, as I see both as equally viable approaches if done right, but games that take the more minimalistic approach strike me as interesting since nowadays most mainstream games, especially AAA games, are comparatively so bloated in scope. Roboquest, to quote its description, is a fast-paced FPS roguelite, playable in solo or two-player co-op where you jump into the steel shoes of a high-powered, hyper-mobile robot and fight like never before. Run through randomly generated environments on an unrecognizable Earth. Scorched canyons and vivid cities, hacked with secrets, upgrades, and enemies. And destroy every last laser-shooting evil bot and boss that stands in your way, choosing from an arsenal of handcrafted weapons to do so. I'm a little hesitant to say this is really a roguelite. The term roguelite is so widespread nowadays it has almost lost all meaning at this point, especially since the core identifying mechanic, permadeath, isn't really fully implemented here, as the next line of the game's description points out. As a Steam Early Access title, we do have the standard Q&A Early Access description, where at least these developers actually bothered to use their own words rather than a simple variation on the default 1 to 2 sentence generic answers most Early Access developers provide. Probably the same placeholder text that Valve gave them to expand upon. Normally I would consider a clear and concise early access roadmap or description page to be the bare minimum in terms of transparency, but from my experience, few enough Steam developers even bother to go that far, and it's not like Steam really cares about making its storefront look good at any given time. Not when they can dive and swim in their dollar bills like Scrooge fucking McDuck in his personal gold vault. And no, I don't know why my brain went to DuckTales all of a sudden, but I am a 90s kid, so you're gonna have to put up with the Disney nostalgia of it all. The game is planned to be in early access for about 8 to 10 months, of relatively short duration, although, as ever when we're talking about anything early access related, that very well might and probably will change. When it comes to early access, we can't really take anything for granted. The game in its current state is described to contain about 1/3 of its total campaign length, which would put it theoretically at about 5 to 6 hours long, which for an FPS game is a reasonable average amount of time. That said, however, that will depend on the game's final post-early access price, as the developers do state the game will receive a price increase at the conclusion of the early access period. As far as raw content goes, the early access version we're looking at now contains 5 biomes, 40 equipable weapons, 20 enemy types, and 2 bosses. Now I'll get into talking about the bosses and weapons a little bit later, but what I do want to talk about a bit right now are the enemy types. Even after about 4 hours spent in the game, I don't feel like there were really 20 different enemy types. I don't mean to imply that the developers are lying, but a lot of the enemies feel so similar in both visual design and how they attack the player that you wouldn't really notice the diversity in the game's enemy AI ecosystem. For the most part, you're going to be dealing with these little drones that shoot fairly slow projectile shots at you from mid to long range. Many other types of enemies do appear, but because they share that similar futuristic design and the ranged fire attack behavior, it's easy to lump them in together. Were I to jump into something like Doom Eternal and replay it, I could easily tell you the difference between most of the game's basic enemy types, from your normal imps to a dreadnought or a cyber demon or really whatever, complete with a rough description of their abilities. And I'm not even what you call a hardcore Doom fan, far from it. Here, though, the enemies just don't stick out in my mind as clearly as those from Doom, for example. It's not that the enemies are badly designed, I just think both visually and mechanically they could use a bit of work to make the distinction a bit more obvious. Now, before we go any further, I do have a bit of a side tangent I want to address, and that is how few people will seem to really know anything about this game, and that is, quite frankly, very much a pity. My first interaction with Roboquest was a promotional tweet on Twitter that happened to come across my feed. I have a somewhat mixed opinion on Twitter as a platform, even though it's currently my preferred choice of social media. But one thing I've always liked about Twitter is that it's far easier on Twitter to discover and interact with smaller brands, artists, and creators than it is on, say, Facebook, for example. I was watching a trailer for the game, and first thing I have to say is that the music for this game, as well as the weird killstreak announcer, are both really bad to a cringeworthy degree. If the developers are watching this, I'm sorry, but your trailer really sucks. But what got my attention more than just a few minor qualms about the trailer audio was how this game really doesn't shy away from its older retro FPS inspirations. So I sent over a request for a review key, a fairly standard industry practice. It's not uncommon for a key request to take anywhere from several hours to maybe a day or two, maybe even a week, before they're received. My request for a review key was granted in less than 45 minutes. Between that surprise and their otherwise fairly open and transparent approach in regards to how they interact with their community on Steam and Discord, and how they give the community more than ample opportunities to give feedback and influence the development process, it strikes me as a very positive approach to development. So bonus points for that. During the course of putting together this video, as a matter of practice, I reached out to a member of the development team to inquire who I should send press inquiries to, who I should talk to if I had any questions about the game or its development, etc. And they quite bluntly invited me to talk to just them directly. It was honestly very refreshing to have a one-on-one conversation without the usual forced formality that tends to be fairly commonplace in industry. I've dealt with a lot of developers, even moderately small indie teams, that have this somewhat aloof attitude when it comes to engaging with those both inside and outside their core community. So again, credit to them. But back to talking about the game itself. One of the first things you'll notice upon starting the game is that before and usually at the conclusion of each level, you're presented with this motion comic, which looks like it was designed less as a comic and more like concept art for the game itself. This gimmicky idea of having comic book-like cutscenes definitely ties in with the game's chosen art style, but it doesn't really serve much of a purpose outside of that. It doesn't do much, if anything, to expand on the lore or really give us anything in the vein of character interaction, aside from a few casual remarks. Also, the loading animation for each new panel is really slow and doesn't really look very nice, put it bluntly. I would much rather prefer it if the developers went for a more panel-by-panel approach, and just let the player hit left or right or A and D or some such back-and-forth manual override system, and have the comic panels play out corresponding transition animations. That would have been far more dynamic and user-engaging as opposed to this basic slideshow approach. I admit I'm just nitpicking here, but I wish I wasn't forced to either wait through the painfully slow animations or to skip the entire cutscene, but instead had a third possible option for a speed control. That said, lack of speed is a criticism I can certainly not apply to almost any other single element of the actual gameplay. I find Roboquest interesting because in some aspects of its gameplay, it definitely leans more in the more casual pick-up-and-play approach in regards to how it equips the player with very potent, arguably in some cases slightly overpowered, weaponry, the majority of which being fairly easy to learn and master. The weapons tend to have a moderately low skill ceiling. This isn't Team Fortress 2, where you'll likely spend dozens if not hundreds of hours using one specific loadout, and still gradually improving your skill with it, or Doom where you're forced to stick with constantly rotating between the same 5 or 6 weapons, and punished for playing favorites by running out of ammo constantly, making you feel like that youngest kid on the block running around with a super soaker gun that ran out of water hours ago. Likewise, there isn't a huge focus on scopes or long-range shots, although there are some guns that definitely provide that functionality. Instead of vying for the strictly traditional approach of permadeath, a fairly common mechanic in roguelike and roguelite games, Roboquest incorporates a more soft-core version of that idea, where upon dying, the player is sent back and whatever character-specific perks you've unlocked thus far will reset, but any weapon that you've placed in a weapon storage container, assuming that you've unlocked the required perk, will be saved for your next playthrough. This isn't a game where you necessarily have to grind, but it is a game where you are naturally incentivized and rewarded for having grinded. This isn't like The Division or other such mainstream looter shooters, where the game really only starts becoming fun when you have higher level, rare, or legendary loot. I'm looking at you right now, Avengers, even though I've yet to play you. The leveling system here in Roboquest seems instead designed to enhance your experience, rather than create it. It's a good extra layer of content for those who are already enjoying what's on screen in front of them, but it's not likely going to change the opinion of someone who is not already invested in the game itself. While we're on the topic of unlocks and grind, let's take a look at the base upgrade system. You start off with this really simple desert camp, barely more than a couple of tents and a busted up RV that looks like it's on its last legs, and begging for that sweet, merciful taste of nothingness. By playing through each campaign level, you earn what are effectively skill points, which can be used to unlock more tools within your base, or upgrade existing modules. I've spent a little under 4 hours in the game itself, and I've already unlocked and upgraded pretty much everything in sight as far as I can tell. Hopefully more base upgrades continue to get added in future updates, because I'd hate to think most of the game's unlocks can be already gained so soon. I'm not going to go into detail on every single upgrade because that would take far too long, but I do want to point your attention to a few of the more fun and useful ones that caught my eye and were a noticeable improvement to the gameplay flow for me as a player. The first being an increase to the number of character upgrade choices presented to the player when they level up. Initially this starts at 2, but can be increased to a total of 4 if you spend points on those 2 plus 1 capacity upgrades. The same could be said of cores, aka the game's rune system if you will. Cores provide passive buffs like increases to damage output for certain kinds of weapons. You'll end up swapping between cores depending on your current loadout. You can also build an artifact rack where you can swap between certain utility providing devices. 2 of the ones I've unlocked so far from my repeated playthroughs are the jetpack and backpack. The jetpack, obviously, allows you to fly certain limited distances, though the acceleration is very slow and the duration of said flight is very restricted. The backpack is a lot more straightforward, allowing you to carry 1 additional weapon of your choice in your loadout. Personally, I find the jetpack far more useful in many situations than the backpack, since the added verticality makes it somewhat easier at times to navigate certain areas and avoid taking damage, especially when it comes to dealing with the second boss in the game, as you're in a very small arena where you need to constantly drop and rise in height in order to stay out of range of the boss's attacks. Small spoiler, by the way. And that gets us to probably the last point I want to bring up, and that is the bosses themselves. It's hard to think of yourself as a truly retro-inspired first-person shooter game without having irritatingly aggressive and powerful bosses. The bosses in Roboquest are not necessarily hard, they are very bullet spongy and do have a habit of spraying you with a lot of consistent low damage attacks. That can deal quite a bit of damage if you're stupid enough to stand there like an idiot gritting your teeth and take it. In hindsight, I've realized that probably could have been worded better, given the various implications, but to hell with it, I'm leaving it in. Enjoy. I do plan to hopefully return to this game later on, once new content has been added to the game, given that the initial public early access build of the game contains only a handful of levels and 2 total bosses. There's still a long way to go before I can come close to thinking of this game as a full complete product. I think of this game as somewhat of a long-term investment. Considering the dev team are aiming to have at least 1 major update per season, we're looking at roughly 3 to 4 such updates between now and this time next year, when hopefully the game can be considered a full product. The developers have confirmed on the game's Steam store page that the current price, $19.99, will be increased when the game exits early access. So it really becomes a matter of preference. Would you rather buy in now, knowing that it's still an incomplete in the works project, and become part of that community of playtesters, or would you prefer to wait to get the full experience even if it means you have to spend $5 or $10 more? As of the time of recording, I've spent about 4 hours in-game. 4 hours spent in a game that can realistically be played through in maybe an hour at most, maybe less. And I regret nothing. Yeah, sure, do I have some individual nitpicks with the odd weapon or 2, or maybe the rare issue or 2 with the enemy AI design? Yes. But overall this game shows way more polish than I would expect from an early access game at this newly released pre-alpha or alpha state. And I for one am very curious to see what direction it continues to take moving forward. If you're interested in the somewhat fast-paced combat flow, one not quite as brisk as, say, Doom Eternal, but still with a fast-moving tempo combined with a Borderlands-esque weapon system and a similar art style, although certainly not a derivative one, Roboquest combines some of the best of both worlds. So it may strike your fancy, or maybe not. As ever, these are simply my opinions, interpret them however you wish. God knows, based on the reaction to my Paladins video, I do not expect the majority of people to agree with me. On that note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. If you want to see more review and first impression type content from me in the future, I highly encourage you to consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you can get notified when a new video goes live. I'm not one of those channels that does daily uploads, so don't worry about me potentially spamming your notification feed unnecessarily. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments down below. I nearly always respond to comments posted on any of my videos. Given the amount of people who historically have continually expressed surprise that I do so, I can only assume I'm one of the few content creators to actually enjoy responding to comments. I like the conversation. I don't like the feeling of just talking to a bodiless microphone. It's not very sexy when you think about it, and it makes it more fun when I know I can look forward to hearing other people's point of view as comments under my videos. That said, this is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome, everybody. Stay safe and peace out.